So far in this course, we've talked a lot about the ways in which values might influence science, for good or ill. This week, I'd like to talk about the reverse direction. Are there ways in which science might impact our values? The picture that's to my left here is by Paul Gauguin, and in the top left-hand corner, he wrote, in French, the following questions. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? And I think that those are questions that science has the potential to help answer, if not completely answer. And furthermore, I do think that they're questions that have potential moral significance for the question that Tolstoy presents. So Tolstoy asks the following question, which I think adds on to Gauguin's questions. He says, science is meaningless because it gives no answer to our question, the only question important for us. What shall we do and how shall we live? Okay, so that's the central ethical question. How should we live? And I think that there is some connection potentially between Gauguin's question of like, what are we and where do we come from? And Tolstoy's question, which is, how should we live? But that relationship is by no means simple or straightforward. And this week, I want to look a little bit at their potential interrelations. Okay, so one way that they might be connected is through the idea of human nature. So a very common way in which people think that maybe science might give us a little bit of ethical guidance, that is guidance about the question, how should we live, is by telling us what kind of things we are. That is telling us a little bit about human nature. So I think that that's a reasonable place to look. I do think that that's a potentially interesting connection, but I'm going to raise some concerns for it through this lecture and then the next one, which will take up the readings for this week. So just do a little bit of philosophical background on this. So some very famous ancient people who talked about human nature. Mencius is a sort of post-Confucian philosopher. So he's in the Confucian tradition. He's regarded sometimes as the sort of second most central philosopher in that tradition. And Mencius argues that we have a human nature and that it's basically good in the sense that human beings naturally tend towards benevolence and righteousness unless some specific circumstances force us to deviate from those sort of natural predispositions. He compared it to water flowing downhill, right? So you can force water uphill. You can dam it, or you can like pick it up in a cup and throw it up. But its normal, natural disposition is to go downhill. And Mencius thinks that human nature is quite a lot like that in the sense that we flow downwards towards goodness. And for him, goodness is benevolence, which is a sort of fellow feeling between humans, and righteousness, which is a sort of disdain or disgust towards ill behavior. So Mencius thinks we are by nature good beings. Now, there's another philosopher in the Confucian tradition, Zunzi, and he's also a Confucian philosopher, sort of shortly after Confucius, but he thought that the human nature is essentially bad. And it's really only the effects of culture and education and training and sort of like your upbringing and stuff like that that makes humans kind of worthwhile beings. Left to our own devices, Zunzi thinks, we would just be awful. So I think it's interesting to think about what's at stake in this disagreement between Mencius and Zunzi. How much can you leave people to their own devices? How much do we need to intervene on people actively in order to get what I assume we all want, which is a society full of benevolent and righteous humans, right? You want people who are both kind and who dislike evil or something like that for whatever versions of kindness and evil that you subscribe to. So one sees us as capable of good, but only under pressure. And one sees us as naturally tending towards good unless something gets in the way. And I do think that those have substantially different practical consequences for how we should organize society. So just a couple of ancient views on human nature from Chinese philosophy. Another famous philosopher who had thoughts on this is Aristotle. So Aristotle's in this very old tradition of thinking that there is an important connection between what kind of beings we are and how we should act. So Aristotle, for example, thinks that humans are defined as rational animals. That's the most characteristic thing about humans is our rationality. And we have a few different essences, Aristotle calls them. That is, we have vegetative nature, so vegetables, vegetative. So plants all have this nature of taking in nutrients and growing and reproducing. So we share that with every living thing. We also have an animal nature shared with all of the animals. So we move around, we can sense our environment, that kind of thing. But we also have a typically human nature, and essentially human nature. Aristotle thinks that the core of that is our rationality, and that if you accept that line of reasoning, if you think that that is our core nature, then you know what the best kind of life is. The best kind of life is, of course, the life of pure rationality, because that's what we are as humans. So, shocker, a philosopher thinks that philosophy is the best way to live. It is, by the way, but not because of what Aristotle says. Okay, so Aristotle thinks that there's this really tight connection between what kind of beings we are and how we should live. Okay, and it sounds pretty rosy, but I bring up Aristotle both as an interesting sort of historical thinker who makes this connection and as a kind of warning, because Aristotle's view on human nature had some pretty nasty consequences. So, for example, Aristotle lived in ancient Greece, and ancient Greece was a slave society. The practice of owning another human was pretty common. And Aristotle has this whole theory about how some people are natural slaves, that is, their inner nature, their inner disposition, makes them a little less than human, and it makes it okay to own them because that's their sort of natural place in the universe. So I bring this up because not just to slander Aristotle, although a little, but also to, as a kind of warning or caution sign about the very idea of human nature. Because human nature, like so many ideas that we've talked about in this course, functions very often as a kind of blank page on which people can project their own values. So when Aristotle says that some people just have the slave nature, what he's doing, I take it, is projecting the values of his culture onto the sort of inner fixed essence of some individuals. And that's, in this case, obviously has awful consequences, right? So the idea that some people are just naturally slaves is an abhorrent idea. And Aristotle gets sort of sucked into it because he gets sucked into thinking that this is a feature of nature rather than a feature of his culture by the device of human nature. So that's the kind of danger of this idea. I don't think that it's always the case that people will go there. I don't think it's always the case that everybody will use human nature as an excuse to justify their worst behavior, but it is a danger of this idea. Okay, so keep that in mind as we discuss the very idea of human nature. It's been abused in some extremely serious ways. Okay, so a modern philosopher who argues for a connection between human nature and ethics is Philippa Foot. So Philippa Foot, she's a 20th century philosopher. She died about 10 years ago, something like that. She doesn't advocate slavery, just to be very clear about that. But she argues that if we're going to understand morality itself, if we're going to make sense of moral language, like this is bad, or this is evil, or this is good, or this is virtuous, we have to tie that language to our understanding of the structure and nature of living things. So that's our basic claim. Let me expand on that a little bit. So Foote argues that when we say that an action or a situation is good, that's a kind of subcategory of a broader kind of language game where we talk about, say, a good cactus. So what counts as a good cactus depends on the species of cactus, of course. Some things are good for a particular cactus and some things are bad. If a cactus has a disease or it's sort of misgrown or it's not sort of flourishing as a cactus, our claim that that's so always depends on what we think is in some sense natural for that species of cactus, of tree, for whatever living thing. So these aren't whims or opinions. It's not like we sort of make up in a purely subjective sense, what counts as good for that cactus. There are some things, Foote argues, that are just good for that cactus. That is, there are some things that are in the world count as a flourishing cactus and some things that don't. And she thinks that when we're talking about, when we're using our typical moral language, what we have to mean, in order for that language to have content, what we have to mean is that there's some connection between goodness and badness and, for example, harms or benefits or importance or unimportance. And those ideas are all relative to some kind of way of living in the world as an organism. What counts as harmful, what counts as beneficial, are all relative to us as a living thing. And, for example, lots of carbon dioxide is really good for a tree, really bad for us. We die. So the goodness or badness of carbon dioxide isn't a thing that you can put any kind of significance on. That is, you can't say that CO2 is good or bad, except relative to some living thing. And it's going to be different for each different living thing. So what that means, according to Foote, is that we can't really think clearly about ethics. We can't really make sense of ethical language unless we do a kind of careful study of the structure and nature of living things. And our ethical language is always relative to some nature or other. Her most famous book is called Natural Goodness. Okay, so that's her argument. In the readings for this week, Tim Lewins is going to criticize this idea. So he's going to criticize it on the basis that we really just don't have a clear enough notion of what human nature would be in order to base our kind of ethical language on that. So we don't have a clear enough question to Gauguin's, we don't have a clear enough answer to Gauguin's question, what are we? So what are we, not just what are all the details of our life, but what's sort of core to us, what's essential to us? And Lewins is going to argue that we just really don't have an answer to that. And maybe, or probably, there isn't an answer to that. So there isn't an answer, Lewins is going to argue, to what kind of beings are we really? I mean, you can add up all the facts of an individual life. Of course, you can come up with true descriptions of human beings, but you can't come up with some kind of essence, some human nature, which would characterize what we are in some deep sense. So if that's right, then science by itself really just doesn't give us a picture of human nature that could ground our ethical talk in the way that Foote hopes it would. And, we can, of course, so we can learn lots of natural facts. We can learn, where our species comes from. We can learn some very typical features of it. But what Lewins is hoping for, or at least what he thinks people like Philippa Foote are hoping for, is something deeper than that, something like an essential nature that we could use to say what counts as a harm or a benefit. And so in the next video, I'll look at his critique and why he thinks that's not going to be the case. Okay. But before that, let me just sort of set up a few things. So if we're going to say what human nature is, we're going to have to talk about humans. And human is shorthand, I take it, for a species. That's us, Homo sapiens. So it turns out to be actually pretty hard even to say what a species is. So if you're going to say what the core features of the human species are, you better be able to tell me what a species is. And even that turns out to be super difficult. So according to Maiden 1997, there are more than 20 different concepts floating around in the literature and biology for how to define a species, none of which give the exact same answer as to what the sort of core features of that species are, or when two living things would count as members of the same species. So let me just go through two of them really quickly to show you what kinds of problems crop up. So if you've heard of species concept, you might have heard this one. It's sometimes called the biological species concept. It's not a bad one. It does its job in a bunch of contexts, but it doesn't work all the time. So the biological species concept is cashed out in terms of interbreeding with fertile offspring. So are two living things, so you've got two living things, A and B, are A and B members of the same species? And this criterion for species membership says you're the same species if you can interbreed and have offspring which themselves can have kids. So interbreeding with fertile offspring. So pictured here is a mule. A mule is the offspring of a donkey and a horse, and mules themselves can't have kids. They're sterile. So according to this definition, donkeys and horses are different species because they can't produce fertile offspring. Okay, so how about that? How about that as a definition of what counts as a species? And this is a pretty common one. One pretty serious problem for this is that most living things don't have to have sex to reproduce. Most living things on this planet reproduce asexually. So bacteria, most simple life, tons and tons of plants, some more complex life. There's a bunch of species of reptiles that can reproduce asexually. So it just doesn't apply to most living things. That's not really great if what you want is a definition of species, all right? You would want it to apply to most life if, right. Okay. Another kind of trick for this one is what are called ring species. So depicted here is the sort of distribution of a particular, what we might call a species of seagulls. Now, ring species are species that are sort of widely distributed geographically. You can see that these seagulls are widely distributed around the North Pole. And if we try to apply our interbreeding with fertile offspring criterion to these seagulls, we come up with a bit of a paradox. It doesn't really work because the seagulls in the group 1 and 2 can perfectly happily interbreed and produce fertile offspring, so good. And 2 can do the same with 3 and 3 with 4, and probably 1 can do it with 3 or 4. But if 1 and 7 try to have children, they don't get fertile offspring. Okay, so what that means is 1 and 7 aren't members of the same species according to this definition, but 1 and 2 are members of the same species, and 2 and 3, and 3 and 4, and 4 and 5, 5 and 6, and 6 and 7. So there's some really strange situation here where 1 and 7 both are and aren't members of the same species. So it should be the case. You'd think it would be the case that if 1 and 2 are the same species and 2 and 3 are the same species, then 1 and 3 should be the same species, and so on transitively around the whole ring. But we get these situations where there's a kind of blurry cutoff where 1 and 7 look like they should both be the same species and not the same species. So we get weird paradoxes like that. Okay, so, all right, so we're not going to be able to apply the biological species concept all the time. There's a bunch of other species concepts. There's no way I can go through these exhaustively, but I'll just throw out one more for your consideration, which is thinking about species as individuals. And both of these concepts are going to be, so the different ways of treating species are going to be relevant when we talk about Lewin's paper. So species in this sense, species as individuals, are rather thought about in terms of a specific collection of living things, right? They're not defined in terms of a category or any kind of criteria for entry. It's like a family tree. Whoever's in your family tree is in your family tree. And it's rather than being a categorical requirement. So to be a Lewis, you must have, weird arched eyebrows and brown eyes and whatever. That's not how we define being in a family tree, right? And the species as individuals concept treats species in just the same way. It's just being in the same species is just a matter of being descended in the right way or being related in the right way to other members of the species. So, consider how the names of species, to get the difference, and I do think it's important to get the difference between a categorical species concept and species as individual. Consider how the names of species work. What does the name of a species do? So here's a fox. The name of its species is Vulpes vulpes, right? The Linnaean two-part categorization. So we think of species. I think the intuitive way of thinking of species is as a kind of category, right? A category like triangle or odd number. So to be a member of the category triangle, you have to have 3 straight lines, 3 internal angles, a closed figure, two-dimensional object with 3 straight lines and 3 internal angles. That's it. And if you got that, you're a triangle. Congratulations. If you want to be an odd number, you have to be a number not easily divisible or not evenly divisible by 2. That's it. If you have those 2 things, you're an odd number. And those are categories of things, right? You determine category membership by applying some set of criteria. If you meet those criteria, you're in the category. And I think it's very natural and intuitive to think of species that way. So you're a member of Vulpes vulpes if you have 4 legs and you're a mammal and you got a snout of this shape, or maybe you got certain genes or something like that. But if we take species to be individuals, then the name Vulpes vulpes really functions more like a proper name, right? It functions like the name Corey or Jane or something like that, right? So species as individuals, the name Vulpes vulpes picks out some collection of actual living things in the world without applying kind of categorical membership to it. In just the same way the name Corey picks out an individual, but there's no category membership for being a Corey Lewis, right? There's no like list of properties that I have to be me. The name just picks out me as an individual. So the difference between the biological species concept and the species as individuals is one is treating a species like a category and one as a set of individuals, as a species as an individual. But if species are individuals rather than categories, then there's not really a good reason to think that they have an essence, as it were. That is, there's probably no set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a fox. If the species are thought of as individuals, then a fox is a fox just in case it's related to other foxes. That's it. That's the whole story. There's no essential foxiness of fox that we could sort of distill down and say, if you have these properties, then you're a fox, other than being related in the right way. So being descended from other foxes. Like that's the whole story about what it means to be a fox. And if that's right, then we shouldn't think that there's anything like the essential nature of a human being. If species are best thought of as individuals, being a human being is just a matter of being descended from other human beings. End of story. There's no kind of category membership. There's no essence of what it is to be a human. So that's just kind of some setup for what we're going to get into in the next video, which is Lewin's critique of the idea of human nature. It's far from obvious. The point here has been, it's far from obvious that science sort of neatly serves up to us a clear concept of human nature that we could then use to try to figure out how we should live our lives. In the next video, I'm going to go through Lewin's argument in some detail, and we'll see at least what one side of this debate about human nature looks like.